Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 24th Annual Jewish Book Festival, sponsored by the Jewish Federation of the San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys. I'm Barbara Droutman, co-chairing this event with Debbie Noble. It takes a tremendous amount of effort and commitment to create this festival. So before we start our program, I'd like to acknowledge and thank all the people involved. To our dedicated committee members, our advanced readers, the Federation staff, and our coordinator, Rebecca Russell, the Jewish Book Council in New York, from which we choose our authors, our behind-the-scenes tech wizard, Jake Tavel, and our literary circle members whose financial support make this entire festival possible. This evening's program will be a presentation by Jen Maxfield, followed by Q&A. Since you are watching virtually and may have questions, just go to the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen and type in your questions at any time. The chat will be disabled. If you wish to purchase this book or any other book for this year's book festival, you will have the opportunity to do so at any in-person book festival event, visit the Federation office, or follow the link provided in the chat. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's author, Jen Maxfield. Jen is an Emmy Award-winning correspondent and anchor for NBC New York for the past 2 decades. She's covered many of the most memorable and exciting events, including Captain Sullenberger's Miracle on the Hudson, the devastation of Superstorm Sandy, and award-winning COVID-19 coverage. Maxfield holds a Master of Science from Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, where she also teaches. In addition, she's a longtime volunteer with many organizations, including, but not limited to, Women's Rights Information Center, Jewish Women International, and the Triple Negative Breast Cancer Foundation. Her first book, More After the Break, was an instant Amazon bestseller. She lives in Bergen County, New Jersey, with her husband, 3 children, and dog. Welcome, Jen. Jen Maxfield, and thank you for joining us. We're so looking forward to your presentation.
Well, Barbara, thank you so much for that introduction. And really, thank you so much to everyone affiliated with the Jewish Federation of San Gabriel and Pomona Valleys for inviting me tonight to share a little more about my book and my story, and to all of you for logging on to Zoom this evening. I'm so happy that we're working in Pacific time here because I'm talking to you from my home in New Jersey. And I actually just got back from emceeing another event earlier tonight on New York time, and that was at the Pierre Hotel in New York City. It was a fundraiser for the Soroka Medical Center in Israel. They're raising money for a new neonatal intensive care unit, that hospital right there in the Negev desert. So it makes me very happy that we were able to fit all of it in today and that you're joining us. So I did want to start sharing my screen here because I have a slide presentation to share with everybody. I would love to tell you a little bit more about me and my career and the way this book came together. And then I'm so looking forward to also hearing from you and having that conversation. I know Barbara's going to kick us off in the Q&A after I tell you a bit more about myself. And then I hope that we do have some questions from the audience as well. And I always say that I really love speaking with Jewish groups, Jewish Federation, JCC, because fun fact, my first job was not on the news. Fun fact, my first job was not as a reporter or a professor or a news anchor. My first job was as a lifeguard at the Kaplan JCC on the Palisades. This is a photo from the early 90s. That's me in the middle. I was a lifeguard at the Kaplan JCC on the Palisades. This is in Tenafly, New Jersey. And I used to not only work as a lifeguard, but also as a swim instructor at the day camp there. So I'm so happy, as I mentioned, to have an opportunity to speak with you about my new book, More After the Break. And to get started, I'd love to tell you about my career journey. So the book came out in July, but my career in news actually started about a quarter century ago. And I'm also interested in explaining to you how it is that after covering news these past 22 years on television, I estimate I've done more than 10,000 interviews over that time, two of whom are pictured right here on your screen. And so I'm interested also in speaking with you tonight about how it was that I did these 10,000 interviews and then narrowed it down to the 10 stories that are featured in my book more after the break. So keeping with the book theme tonight, I have broken up my presentation into chapters. So we're going to start with chapter 1, which I call Zero Calls Back. So let's take it way back. First of all, I grew up the oldest of 6 children in Tenafly, New Jersey. This is a photo from when I was about 14 or 15 years old. And I think it's so funny because the rest of my siblings and my parents are all dressed up and somehow I'm in a news anchor outfit. I don't know why I chose to wear that as a high school student, but yes, so I'm the oldest of 6 kids. And growing up, I did a lot of team sports. And I looked up to both of my parents, my mom obviously showing a lot of leadership in the home, raising the 6 of us, and then my father working as a doctor. And so I thought because I loved sports, I was really into math and science, and my career goal at this age from this photo was to be a sports medicine physician. So as I said, when I went to Tenafly High School, class of 95, there on the left, my career goal was to just follow my love for sports and help people with their sports injuries. So when I went off to Columbia in 1995, it was actually as a pre-med student. But I always loved to write. I had a column for my high school newspaper and for the Columbia Daily Spectator as an undergrad at Columbia College, but I didn't know any professional journalists and there were no journalists in my family. I didn't really have anyone to model myself off of. So I never really thought about journalism as a career choice, but rather that writing and reporting and reading were things that I just enjoyed doing more as hobbies, frankly, at that point. But then something happened my junior year at Columbia, and that is that I saw a listing for an internship at CNN at the United Nations. And I was paired, thankfully, with Gary Tuckman. And really, I took the internship sort of on a whim. I didn't have class on Fridays. And I thought, well, I enjoy politics and I like news, so I'll try this when I don't have class on Fridays. So I was paired with CNN national correspondent Gary Tuckman, who's still a national correspondent for CNN. And he not only allowed me to go to news conferences, ask questions of diplomats, write the first draft of his CNN radio stories. I was 20 years old. It was an incredible internship. But Gary also taught me about the importance of compassion when reporting on people on the news. Gary has an address book that he keeps with him to this day. And I spoke with him last year as part of the research for the book, and he shared with me that he had recently called a family out of the address book who he had interviewed back in 1995 when he was covering the Oklahoma City bombing. So we're talking about going back more than a quarter century to call people not for another interview, not for a news special, but truly just to tell them that he was thinking about them and that he still cared and that they meant more to him than just that interview. And so working with somebody like Gary so early in my career not only inspired me to choose journalism as a career path, but also inspired me to be the type of reporter that I wanted to be and that I hope that I've been these past 22 years. So I mentioned that the chapter is called Zero Calls Back, and that's because in 2000, I sent out 65 of these. This was my original resume tape on a VHS, I might add. And not only did I not get calls and emails back right away, I never got any calls or emails back after sending 65 of those tapes out. And I was so dejected. And thankfully, the news director in Binghamton, New York, when I was on a road trip up there, agreed to meet with me for 5 minutes. And I was able to get that first job on air in Binghamton, New York, the 154th largest media market in the country, I might add. And he did hire me at that time. So before you knew it, I had moved to a city where I knew absolutely no one, to work for a job that paid so little I could not even afford a cell phone that year. And by the way, I was actually promoted to the main female anchor position after just 6 weeks. This after not even being able to get anybody to call me back because another woman at the station had left to go somewhere else, and I was really their only choice in-house. And then in 2001, I moved up to the ABC station in Syracuse, New York, which is the 81st largest media market in the country. And I worked there as a reporter and anchor, and I wore some questionable jackets. Thankfully, this particular one has been retired. I'd like to say it was the style in 2001. I'm not really sure, but it's okay. You can laugh to yourself at home with this slide. All right, let's move into chapter 2 now and talk about connections. So despite the low pay, and I might add, the distance from my college boyfriend, Scott, who's now been my husband of almost 19 years, I discovered in Binghamton and Syracuse just how much I enjoyed stepping into people's lives and telling their stories. So whether it was interviewing someone after a natural disaster or after a crime had been committed, I did find that I was able to connect with people and that I really enjoyed being trusted to tell their stories. So I mentioned before that I was the oldest. I am the oldest of 6 children. And one thing my parents always taught the 6 of us was to treat other people the way you want to be treated. And between hearing that from my parents and working with Gary Tuckman as the first journalist who I modeled myself off of, I always took a very personal and humanistic approach to the news over the years. I've never seen people as just an interview or just a job. And look, I recognize that I'm not a doctor, I'm not a police officer, I can't heal people's wounds or arrest assailants, but I am there to listen and to share their stories with the broader community. As a reporter for 2 decades now, I currently work for NBC in New York, and I have worked there for the last 9.5 years. And for the 10.5 years prior to that, I was working for the ABC station in New York, Eyewitness News. Chapter 3 is called The First Rough Draft of History. So I'd like to first set the stage here for how I wrote my book by explaining to you what a typical day in the newsroom is like. So a typical news story for me is less than 2 minutes long, and I rarely work on that story for more than an 8 or 10-hour shift. So we pitch story ideas in our morning meeting. Sometimes our managers take them, sometimes we're assigned to something else. And then I go out with a photographer and we start reporting the story. It's possible that because of breaking news or a severe weather event that our assignment will change. But the fact of the matter is, every day that I go to work, we don't make phone calls exclusively. Of course, we make them to set up the stories, but it's not that we're reporting everything on the phone or that I'm quoting other people's tweets. We are actually going out into the community, going into people's neighborhoods, sitting inside their living rooms, looking at them face to face, looking in their eyes, and asking them for the privilege, really, of telling their story. And even during COVID, which you can see this photo on the right of your screen, when we had to wear masks and use that big fishpole microphone holder, we were always going out into the community to keep our viewers informed. And this photo, actually, the one on the left, is before COVID. That's from 2017, despite the masks. This is to show you how sometimes our plans at work may change. I could be working on a story all day and then get the call to rush to breaking news. This was actually a chemical fire in 2017 at a plant that made nail polish. And you can see the photographer and I are interviewing a factory worker. And this also exemplifies the fact that I don't interview celebrities at work. People don't wake up in the morning and aspire to be on the news with us. Typically, they are thrust into that situation due to circumstances beyond their control, like that chemical fire that day or the blizzard that I was standing in on the right. So that's why I titled this chapter, The First Rough Draft of History, because there's a great quote that says that that's what news is. We are telling you the first rough draft of what happened. But over all of these years of reporting, I've really had a greater appreciation for how much changes after the story airs, in the weeks and the months and the years and the decades after people's names fade from the headline. So as I mentioned, every morning we pitch stories, and the one constant is that there must be a story that airs on the news that evening. We can't tell our news managers that we can't get the story done that day. We are going to get a story on the air, and rarely do we return to that same news story the next day. So the cycle of being assigned a story in the morning, going out and working on it during the day, broadcasting the details of that story on the air that evening, and then starting it all over again the next day is something that I've been doing for more than 2 decades. So you can understand then how I may have not felt like that was enough, and how there may have been stories, and there are stories that I've covered over these last 22 years, where despite the fact that the photographer and I had moved on to another assignment the next day, I continued thinking about some of the people at the center of those really impactful news stories. And when I set out to write more after the break, my goal was to go back to those people and to ask them to trust me a second time with their stories. The first time, of course, being at the initial news event, and now the second time when I would have the luxury of time to be able to tell you more about their stories and to give you a greater perspective, not only about what it's like to be the center of the news story, but also what it's like to be the reporter and to be in the middle of these stories, and really to give you a sense of perspective about what it's like behind the scenes reporting in local news. So I'm going to tell you briefly about 3 of the stories that I feature in my book. And then again, I look forward to taking your questions. So first, I want to tell you about Euryalus bonea. I first met Euryalus. These photos are screen grabs from the initial story, which was the Monday after Thanksgiving in 2011. Euryalus was 5 years old, and I'm sure you can see by the fact that she doesn't have any hair that she was very sick at this time. She had an aggressive form of leukemia, and she had undergone chemo, and she was getting sicker and sicker, and her family was desperate. And the doctor said, what will save Euryalus' life is if she gets a bone marrow transplant. So fortunately, there was a perfect match within Euryalus' family, her older sister, Giselle. But the trouble was that Giselle was in El Salvador. And by the time I showed up at the family's apartment in Elizabeth, New Jersey, the US government had denied Euryalus' older sister, Giselle, for a humanitarian visa twice. And Euryalus was getting sicker and sicker with her life-saving sister in El Salvador, unable, not allowed to get into the United States. So you can imagine, I'm sure, as I'm reporting this story on this day, and it's really upsetting, and we're trying to do this story that's going to air on the news that night, that ideally will shame the American government into allowing Giselle into the country and really shining a light on this medical issue. So I reported the details of the story that evening and waited to hear what the American government would decide. And then I had the privilege of going home to my own 3 healthy children who are seen here in that same time frame in 2011. In fact, my son Trevor in the middle there was the exact same age as Euryalus, the child who I was reporting on, and a child who was so sick she couldn't even go to school, where my son was at that time for kindergarten. And it's that juxtaposition that I've lived with the whole time that I've been a news reporter. And I also think it's given me a perspective over all of these years to be so grateful for my health and my family's health, because I have been adjacent to so many other people who have been suffering and have not been as fortunate. So I am happy to tell you, though, that this is Euryalus and her sister Giselle, seen here on the left. Our story absolutely did have the intended effect. And within 4 days of the story airing on the news, the US government had reversed its earlier decision. Giselle, at the age of 7 at the time, was allowed into the United States to make that bone marrow donation that saved Euryalus' life. The girls, Giselle did go back to El Salvador under the terms of the humanitarian parole, but the family was able to file the proper paperwork. And Giselle and Euryalus are now in high school together in the US. And the man who you see me with in the red shirt on the right is their grandfather, Gertrudis, who is the person who really fought for Euryalus and fought to get her story on the news, because the family was just so frustrated by not being able to get Euryalus the care that she needed because really of red tape. So this is an example of when we see really the impact of doing a news story. But I would point out that as wonderful as the outcome was for the Bonilla family, I do wonder sometimes when I'm reporting on someone like this, how many other Eurelis Bonillas are there out there? How many other stories could we be working on that we just never hear about and that might not have the same positive outcome? And that's something that weighs on me, and I think a lot of other journalists as well. All right, chapter 5, Chris Clemente. So I'm going to show you first how the world first heard about Chris Clemente. And that was on the cover of the New York Post back in 1990 as the Ivy League crack dealer. This was a real headline, the real front page of the New York Post. Now, I had met Chris 10 years after this headline when I was a grad student at Columbia Journalism School. I had to make a documentary in order to earn my master's degree. And I was researching Chris and another individual who had been sentenced under New York's Rockefeller drug laws, which mandated very long sentences for first-time nonviolent drug offenders. Chris at the time was a sophomore at the University of Pennsylvania. He was a finance student at Wharton, and he had gone home to Harlem to visit his family. And his brother, unfortunately, was dealing drugs and had weapons in his apartment. And when the police came knocking at his brother's door, Chris was in the apartment, and Chris was arrested, charged, and convicted on drug and weapons possession charges and was sentenced to 16 years to life. So I actually saved the letters, which you can see here, if you can see my screen. These are the letters that we wrote back and forth between Greenhaven Correctional Facility, where Chris was in 2000, and my documentary team at Columbia. And here is Chris just last year. Oh, no, sorry, this is Chris last week, I should say. So again, the world meets him as the Ivy League crack dealer. Well, here's Chris today. In the first place, the Rockefeller drug laws were overturned in 2009. And returning to Chris's story for this book was really remarkable because, again, he was a finance student at Wharton, and he continued teaching himself accounting and finance while behind bars in this maximum security men's prison. And Chris, seen here in the suit, is now a CPA, a certified public accountant, and he has his own tax firm. And he's also a comptroller for a not-for-profit organization to help families whose children have blood cancers. So I think that that is another incredible example of the real value in not just letting that New York Post front page be the last word, but following up with someone, in this case, more than 30 years later, and seeing the incredible journey that his life has taken and the systemic change that has happened in the fact that New York has overturned the Rockefeller drug laws that mandated that very long sentence for his first time offense. And this is another photo of Chris, a photo that I took when I was researching the book, and I reconnected with him, and we talked about how very different it was to be meeting outside a university on a beautiful spring day, as opposed to the first time I met Chris, which was at Greenhaven Correctional Facility when I went to visit him when he was still incarcerated. And finally, chapter 6, Zaina Madihan. I mentioned the systemic change when it came to the Rockefeller drug laws. And this is another story where the passage of time since the initial news event really goes to show you just how much change can come about, how much positive change can come about when a person's story is featured on the news and when the community really understands that a wrong has happened. So I met Zaina Madihan in June of 2018. That's the photo you're looking at on the left. Zaina was a survivor, is a survivor of this terrible Paramus school bus accident that happened in New Jersey on Route 80. And of course, that's the image you're looking at on the right. Unfortunately, this bus full of fifth graders, 10 and 11-year-olds, were heading out to a field trip, and the bus driver decided to make what amounted to a U-turn in the middle of an interstate highway. And he slowed down so precipitously that a dump truck driver behind the bus was unable to stop and plowed into the bus, and this horrendous accident happened. And not only was every single child and adult on the bus injured, but Zaina's best friend was killed and her teacher was killed as well. So when I met Zaina to do a series of exclusive interviews with her as a survivor of this crash, it had only happened 3 weeks prior, and she was still healing from her own injuries, which included a concussion. That was in that was in June of 2018. By December, this brave 11-year-old child who had lost her best friend, the child featured on the left-hand side of your screen. But here on the right, we see Zaina, age 11, at the House of Representatives. She spoke on the floor of Congress to lobby for greater bus safety regulations, and lawmakers, both in Washington and in Trenton here at the state level, agreed with her that the laws should change, and children on buses around the country now are safer because of Zaina Madihan and because of what all of those children on the Paramus school bus survived. And I think it's another incredible example of somebody taking adversity in their life and taking something really difficult and horrible that happened to her and rising above it and forming positive change. And so this is Zaina today. She's a sophomore in high school here in New Jersey, and she's doing well. And the people on the right are what I like to call the helpers, the people who rushed in to help when that horrible crash happened on Route 80. The young man on the left is Derek Kunkin. He's an EMT, a paramedic who actually took Zaina to the hospital. And the woman on the right is Claudia Soto, who did one of those things where you always wonder, what would I do in this situation? Claudia Soto was driving to a new job on Route 80 and was lost and came upon this scene about 30 seconds after it happened, well before rescuers were able to get there. And she was able to get out of her car, comfort these fifth graders, and allow many of them to use her cell phone so they could call their parents and tell them that they were okay. These two are really heroes. And I think one of the joys of doing the work that I do, even on days when we're covering some tough stories, is meeting people who are good Samaritans and do really step up to help. So finally, chapter 7, the future of local news. And then I'm looking forward to hearing Barbara's questions and everybody else's questions. So this is an example of where my book is typically displayed in several bookstores in the current events section, right? And I do find it interesting that so many of the other books in that section are about Trump or Biden or January 6th. And obviously politics are important, and that's a very valid thing to be writing and frankly reading about. But I also believe that there's something very unifying about going back to these news stories and looking at the human experience and how the community has come together to help people in their times of need, and how in many cases people are hearing about these situations from local broadcasters and from newscasters. And so we can talk about the future of local news and what's happening right now in the news business, if you're interested in asking questions about that. But just an overview, as I said, I've been a local news reporter for 22 years, and things are changing, right? I'm sure you've noticed in your own community, whether you've lost a local newspaper or your local newspaper is now covering less local news than it did before. Well, 7% of America's counties now have no local news outlet whatsoever. And in fact, 20% of American counties are at risk for becoming what we call news deserts, where it's just hard to find reliable information about politics and education and the environment in your community. Now, in the TV business, we have not seen the job loss that they have in the newspaper business, but we have seen the number of hours that we're covering news go up as far as what we're providing to the public. And so we are doing more work because we have so many more news broadcasts with the same number of people, which really means that we're all doing more work and we're stretched as well. And the contradiction in all this, of course, is that surveys show that people trust their local news correspondents more than national correspondents. All this at the same time that we've seen a 57% decline in newspaper newsroom employees since 2004. And the outcome of this, of course, is that people who aren't getting reliable local news are more likely to be less informed, less likely to vote, more likely to vote along party lines and also makes people more vulnerable to misinformation. And I think we all know how dangerous that sort of thing can be. So again, I just hope that if you get the chance to read my book, which I hope that you do, that it makes you feel as hopeful and inspired as it made me feel when I was reporting it. And also that perhaps it'll prompt you to return to some of your own unforgettable stories. So with that, I want to thank the Jewish Federation again and ask Barbara, I can stop sharing my screen now, and I would love to continue the conversation with Barbara and with all of you. And we can use the Q&A in the chat as well. And while we're waiting for Barbara to come back on, I will take the first question from Merrill. What was your first publication? So I appreciate the question. My first publication was actually the Echo newspaper of Tenafly High School, where I graduated from in 1995. So I did write about various school events. And then, of course, after that, the Columbia Daily Spectator. And then after writing for those student publications, my first professional job off the air was for CNN. And then on the air, as I mentioned, was in Binghamton. So I see we have Barbara back. Barbara's going to unmute herself, and I know we're going to continue the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jen, for that very powerful and very insightful presentation. I know I read the book. I've learned so much about what an actual reporter does and all of your stories. And there was that one question, and I have another question. Were you ever afraid while you were in the moment? Were you ever, and the part two of that question was, when you are in the moment, how do you remain objective and not get emotional? You did explain that answer in the question, but perhaps there was a time that you weren't able to do that, with like, wow, you're human. And how did you always able to stay so cool, calm, and collected?
Well, look, I mean, I think that the day that I stop feeling something when I'm hearing some of these stories is the day that I should retire, truly. And I said to another group recently, I said, I'm a contagious crier, and sometimes if someone else is crying, I'll cry as well, but I just switch to waterproof mascara because I just don't think that I just, but again, there is a professional obligation here, right? So if I'm hysterically crying on the news, that's not helpful to anybody, and it forms a major distraction. And my professional obligation in these moments, when I do go into someone's living room or when I am reporting on something sensitive and I'm approaching someone at a breaking news scene, my professional obligation is to get an accurate story on the air and to make sure that people understand that their story will be featured on the news and how they might be able to provide some information. So I do try to be very upfront when somebody does agree to trust me with their story about how much time, or in some cases, how little time I'll be able to spend with them. And then about how the information, the interview that they do with me or the photo they provide, how that will be featured on the news. And then I listen to their story, but sometimes you're right, it is emotional and it's hard. I'm a mom, as I mentioned, and sometimes these stories, especially the ones that cover terrible things that have happened to children, that can be really tough. And when I come home at night, I plug my work phone in and I really do try to be present for my family. And sometimes it may be something as simple as going for a walk around the block or speaking with the photographer I'm working with about how tough that interview was that we just did. So remaining objective is an interesting thing to think about, because of course I'm reporting the story and trying to get the information to you, the viewer, but also I am with people on their best and sometimes their worst days. And I am a part of that history of their life as well. And I do think that's a big responsibility.
Okay, so I have a question.
Sure.
You talk about forgiveness, and at the very end of your book, you talk about forgiveness and you equate it to the high holidays and forgiveness. And because I read the book, I know when I was reading some of the stories, I found myself having a very hard time forgiving, as you did and as your people did. Um, for those of the people that have not read the book, the one in particular where the house fire, and you went back to visit the grandmother. So, can you give us a little insight about forgiveness, your version of
Sure.
forgiveness, and
Absolutely. And to be clear, I don't feel that I owe any forgiveness to anyone who's a perpetrator of one of these crimes. That's really forgiveness that the families have to give. But what I talk about in the conclusion is really the genesis of the idea for the book. For several years, I had been sitting in temple, either on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, and of course, there's always a lot of conversations surrounding forgiveness and making amends going into the new year, and people who perhaps to whom you owe an apology. And for several years, my mind kept returning to people who I had interviewed and whose stories I had featured on the news, and whether I owed them an apology. And it wasn't necessarily the stories that I had done that year. Sometimes my mind would go back several years or even a decade or more. So I did go into the asks for this book with a great degree of humility. And I was not sure that everybody would be would be welcoming me with open arms. And I do wonder sometimes whether people who agree to be interviewed on the news and who agree to share their story with us, and I must tell you, way more people than not invite us in than people who slam the door, which is astonishing to me. But I would say that I have wondered over the years if the people who invited us in eventually regretted that decision. And I was interested in exploring that as well. And that's what I mean when I say I approach these asks for the book with a degree of humility. And I asked people what it was like to share these details of their story with the general public. But for the most part, people did feel that by having their stories publicized, whether it was for a natural disaster or a medical concern or an incarceration, they did feel that having their story on the news really opened the door for the broader community to step up and help them. And in many ways, that has helped them heal, or in a case like Zaina's, has helped form real change that has improved the lives of many people beyond that initial news event.
okay, now I do have a couple of questions we have from Elizabeth. What was the story that personally affected you the most?
It's hard to choose just one story because there have been so many that have impacted me, but I will share that a little something about the book here and how I was able to put it together. So the first call that I made when I had the idea to do this book was to Corrine Nellius, who, if you read the book, she's the subject of chapter 3. And Corrine's daughter tragically had been the victim of a hit and run accident. And so I met Corrine back in 2011 under these tragic circumstances. And to see what she's been able to do as a grieving mother, but also now a mother supporting other people who have gone through these same sorts of tragedies, I think it gave me a greater perspective on how people heal or don't necessarily heal from some of these traumas, but how they are able to look beyond their own circumstance to reach out a hand to help somebody else. And I think it's so inspiring. And I felt very inspired by Corrine, both writing about her relationship with her daughter, Tiffany, and also writing about everything she's been able to accomplish since she lost her daughter 11 years ago. And so that one really stayed with me, especially, as I said, being a mom now of teenagers and really understanding that deep bond that we have with our children.
We do have some more questions now. Barbara asks, what can you do to discourage political bias that is so prevalent in the news today? And then she also asks, how can we get back to non-political news?
This is a great question. Thank you for that question. So I want to say from the outset that I've always been a local news reporter, and I have never once had anybody tell me to cover a story in a certain way or to talk to one person and not another. I've never had a manager suggest any sort of political slant to any story that I've ever covered. But I do understand the question, because obviously if you watch cable news after 8 o'clock at night, you're seeing a very different experience. I would say, returning to some of my comments earlier about local news and about the decline of local news, that there are real consequences to losing local news outlets in communities. As I said, there's less civic engagement, there's more mistrust of other people, and the idea that people seem to be able or want in many ways to just consume news that reinforces their own beliefs is a problem. And I'm sure everyone on this call and everyone on this Zoom understands that investigative reporting was never profitable. But we all used to buy newspapers, and perhaps some of you still do, but fewer of us buy newspapers because so much of the information that they provided, whether it was the weather or stock prices or sports scores or real estate listings or classified ads, we can now get online. And so we're in this cycle now where newspapers are cutting costs, they're cutting staff, and they're losing subscribers because they're no longer providing that local content. And in many communities, and I'm sure in your community, what has come in to fill part of that void are nonprofit newsrooms. And we have seen this happening in many communities where newspaper reporters have been laid off. And in some cases, they have formed these nonprofit newsrooms, which are existing through a combination of funds from private donors, foundations. In some cases, you can even apply for government grants. Certain states have started to allow that. And they are putting out nonprofit watchdog type news where they are sitting in the state house and watching those hearings. Or a great example of a nonprofit newsroom doing incredible work today is the welfare scandal that's going on in Mississippi right now involving football great Brett Favre, who's accused of being part of a scheme to route millions of dollars that was supposed to go to food and shelter for poor people in Mississippi. And he is part of a scheme where they're accused of using it to build a volleyball gym at the University of Southern Mississippi. And that story was broken by a female reporter at Mississippi Today, which is a not-for-profit newsroom in Mississippi. And the story has now been picked up by the New York Times, the Washington Post, and every other major outlet. So I absolutely think that this idea of feeling like we're more divided and that our news reflects it is a problem, but there are solutions that people are working on to try to take the market forces that are really gutting newspapers in particular and trying to have a different model in some of these not-for-profit newsrooms to still serve the public.
We have another really great question. What advice do you have to young people who are interested in pursuing a career in journalism?
Well, I do have a lot of people who I mentor because in addition to working for NBC as a reporter and anchor, I'm also an adjunct professor at Columbia Journalism School. So I'm very fortunate to work with a lot of young people. And my advice to anyone who wants to pursue journalism is to not go into it with a set idea about what should be changed or an agenda behind your reporting. I believe we serve the community, we serve the public, and the agenda should be truth and accuracy and really shining a light on what's happening in our community. But I do appreciate in my students that they are authentic storytellers. They've grown up with cameras on them at pretty much all times because they've had them on their phones. I think it's more natural for them to do some of the visual storytelling that I've been doing these last 2 decades. And again, I feel that looking at some of these models in these not-for-profit newsrooms is just a fantastic way to focus on the mission of journalism, to inform the public and make sure that people understand what's happening in their communities, whether it's because a new law is being considered, whether it's about whether or not the water is safe to drink or not, or in the case of Zaina, as I mentioned to you, whether school buses are safe and whether drivers are being properly vetted before getting behind the wheel.
We have another question. You mentioned the routine of pitching stories in a morning meeting. Where do you hear of the stories in the first place?
Well, thankfully, I've been reporting on the same community, though it is a very large market. There are 20 million people in the New York media market. It encompasses parts of New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. So I do have quite a few sources at this point, and people know where to find me. And I'm getting tips sometimes through my social media. People may email or call or text me about something that's happening. And I do read some of the not-for-profit newsrooms. I read our local regional newspapers, and that's typically how I hear about things. And I try to stay informed generally. And then, of course, we have a whole assignment desk who I work with at NBC that's just full of incredible people who are very plugged into what's happening. And it is a team effort. I point out in the book that I've never reported a story on my own. I've always worked with a photographer, and I work with also a very large team of people back in the newsroom and we're all working for the same thing, which is to cover the community and to get as many stories as we can out there.
Gretchen has also, she had asked, how has social media changed the work you do? But I think that you answered that question. And then we have another question that you come from such a big, huge family. Can you tell us what your siblings have done with their lives? Have anyone else gone into journalism or reporting or?
Oh, well, thank you for that question. So yes, so as I said, I'm the oldest. I'm 45. My youngest brother is 31. So he was born when I was 14, a freshman in high school. And I'm the only journalist. We did eventually get a doctor. The oldest boy, my brother Mark, is a thoracic surgeon now in the Boston area. And then my next sister is an attorney, she's a matrimonial attorney. I have another sister who is in hotel management. She lives up in the Catskills with her husband. I have a brother who's in finance, and then another brother who lives in Los Angeles, who's an agent out there in Hollywood. And we actually all just came back from your area because he just had his engagement party over the weekend at Pache and Laurel Canyon in LA. So the whole family went out for that, and it was really fun. So big families are a lot of fun. But I did want to add one thing for the question prior about social media, because I did think about something that you might find interesting. So in addition to the fact that just putting stories in my work on social media has created a lot of additional work for me and the other journalists to do, I would just have you consider the difference in showing up for a news scene. So this is partially a social media comment and also really a technology comment generally. Back in 2000, when I started, we'd show up at a breaking news story. And the first thing I did was try to talk to as many people about what they heard, what they saw, what happened, what do you know? Now, we still do that when we show up to a breaking news scene. But the other thing we do is we do a scan of about 10 feet up and we see where all the surveillance cameras are. And we think about how might we get that video to illustrate the story. So technology has been great in a lot of ways. The camera is a lot lighter now, and it's a lot easier to get a live shot on the air than it was 22 years ago. But it's also created greater demand and more pressure, frankly, on some of these stories.
That's great. So I'm sure there are a lot of other questions, but because of time, the last question is, this is your first book, is that correct?
Yes.
Will there be others? Meryl would like to know, will there be others, books of yours?
Well, thank you, Meryl. I wrote this book during COVID. It took me about 10 months, and I am accustomed to writing in a moving news van. So it was something that I was able to do, not because I was working less during COVID, but because so many other things paused for that period of time. It might be hard for me to find the time to write another book. Certainly, I wouldn't be able to do it as quickly as I did this one, but I really did enjoy the process of researching and writing the book. As I said, I found the people I went back to very inspiring, especially writing it during such a tough time during COVID. And I've so enjoyed too conversations like this one, because for all of these years, I've been talking to you through TV and not hearing people answer me back or really having those conversations. So I've so enjoyed being on the book tour and being part of Jewish Book Council and having conversations with communities like yours. So I really thank you, Barbara, and everyone with the Jewish Federation for hosting me tonight.
Thank you again, Jen. I know the pleasure was ours, Jewish Federation. And again, this is the book. If you wish to purchase this book, you will have the opportunity to do so at any in-person event. Visit the Federation office, or please go to the chat and follow the link, the Amazon link. Jen, this has been an amazing evening. We appreciate you. Thank you so much for sharing your book and your life. And now for those of you with children 8 to 12 years old, please join us on Zoom this Sunday, October 30 at 3 p.m., when Joshua Edelglass and Arnon Shore will bring to life the tale of Jose and the pirate Captain Toledano. And please join us next Tuesday, November 1 at 7:30 in person at Temple Beth David or on Zoom, when Benedita Guita will demonstrate some recipes from her book, Cooking alla Judea, a celebration of Jewish food of Italy. Be sure to register in advance to make reservations for these two events and all the other events from the Jewish Book Festival. Thank you so much for supporting the Jewish Book Festival. Have a lovely evening, and we're looking forward to seeing you at the next event. Good night.